Three, two, one, here we go. RAINMAN'S Take podcast. Observations on the world we live in. My take on current events and other topics of interest. Also interviews with some really cool people. So let's get the conversation going. Hey everybody, it's the Rain Man with another great episode for you. Joining me today is documentary film director David Kniess. Dave, how you doing today?
Good, man. Doing good.
Good. Listen, before we get going, let me just say this. If you were part of the RAINMAN'S Take community, thank you very much. If you're new to the program, welcome. I know you're going to love the content, especially in today's episode. So if you could, go ahead and smash that subscribe button on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And if you could watch this movie to the end, that's going to help me with the YouTube algorithm, which will help me get the word out to more people and continue the conversation. So with that being said, I wanted to have Dave on today because we're going to discuss his film, The Gift, which is available on Apple TV right now. Now, if you're a supporter of our military and our vets, or if you want to know what it's like to be on the front lines of combat and how that affects those involved, you have to see this film. Again, you can find it right now on Apple TV. So, David, thanks for joining me. How you doing today?
Good, man. I'm doing good. Thanks for having me.
Good. Well, listen, before we get into it, I was introduced to David through a real good friend of mine who I used to fly with in the Marine Corps. He and Dave are old friends from growing up together in Connecticut. And my buddy, his call sign is Bib. My buddy recently sent out a text letting us all know about David's documentary called The Gift. Now, based on my work with Shelter to Soldier, I know I had to have David on to discuss not only The Gift specifically, but in general, the ongoing struggles and challenges post-combat veterans are facing today. Suicide among our veteran community is rampant, and we need to get a hold of it because too many are dying right now. Again, the film is called The Gift, and you can find it on Apple TV. And if you or a veteran you know are having problems and you don't think there's any way out, there is. Please talk to somebody. And the VA is a great place to start. So The Gift, without giving it all away because we're going to be talking about it, but The Gift is the story of Corporal Jason Dunham, who was with the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines in Husayba, am I pronouncing that? Husayba, Iraq, which is the Iraqi-Syrian border out by Al-Qaim on the Euphrates River. And in April of 2004, Jason was killed, basically gave up his life to save his comrades, and was awarded posthumously the Medal of Honor for his heroism that day. And so The Gift is the story of that, and then what has become of the guys that he left behind since then. And it resonated with me pretty substantially. And to be perfectly honest with you, I was a little nervous about this interview. The same time that happened out in Western Iraq, in Fallujah, kind of the central part of the country, in Fallujah in April as well, that was starting to fire off as well. And we had only been in country, my squadron had only been in country for about a month before we found ourselves flying combat missions downtown Fallujah. So I'm there basically the same time period as this all happened out west. My second deployment, in 2005, we actually spent some time out in Al-Qaim in that whole area. So this, when I watched the movie, when I watched The Gift, a lot of stuff came pouring back, and it was other than it was an awesome movie, and you did a great job with it. It's a pretty heavy story. So, Dave, let's just jump right into it. Why don't you go ahead and tell me how it came about that you wanted to make this film?
Well, I've got to go back about 20 years. It was probably, I think it was 2003. I was taking a flight home to Connecticut to see my folks. I put myself on a red eye out of LAX, sat down, in comes this kid, high and tight, sits down next to me. I knew he was a Marine right away. And me being Navy, we just started shooting the shit. And we just ended up staying up all night until we had our layover, just talking. And it was he's just one of these kids that you meet, one of these people you meet in your life. And it's only happened to me maybe twice, including him. you just know there's something special about that individual, right? He's just squared away, just a super, charismatic, just a great kid.
Yeah.
And we had our layover, and, we stood up, and I knew he was getting ready to deploy. He was on his way home to say goodbye to his folks. So I shook his hand and I said, "Hey man, take care of yourself," And he has this smile, and you could see it in the film and pictures on the internet, but he just has this great smile. He just kind of gave me that look, like, "No worries, man, I got it," and I just watched him walk away. And I just stood there and thought, man, what a great kid. And, I went on about my business, went home to Connecticut. Months later, it must have been about late May, I think it was. I was at Fox Sports at the time in LA, and, the war had kicked off the year before, and now it's 2004, and it's a different war, right? The insurgency has started.
Right.
The IEDs have started. So in all our edit bays at Fox Sports, we've got TVs, and everybody's I'm glued to the news, like what's going on today in Iraq. And somebody came in, they're like, "Hey, you were in the Navy, right?" And I was like, "Yeah." He's like, have you seen this website, iCasualties.org? And I'm like, "No, what's that?" He's like, "Well, it lists all the KIAs from Iraq and Afghanistan." So I went home that night and I started going down the list, and this is 2004. So the majority of those kids on that list were Marines, Anbar Province, the Sunni Triangle. And I got 4 deep into it, and I couldn't remember his last name. I just remember Jason. I saw Jason Dunham, Corporal, 29 Palms, some little town in upstate New York, and I'm like, man, I wonder. So I Google his name, and his picture popped up, and I was like, man, not that kid, I mean, the blood. It's like the blood rush. It really cut me deep, man, And so I sat down and wrote about meeting this kid. A few years before that, I did a documentary on a high school teacher I had, football coach, Dennis Mannion. He was a Marine at Khe Sanh, fought during the whole siege on Hill 861. So he, over the years, had introduced me to all these other Khe Sanh Marines. I'd been to the reunions. They have a message board and a website. So I wrote this story out about meeting Jason Dunham, right? This young kid, and how I just found out that he was, he's dead. He was killed in Iraq. And, mind you, at this point, I didn't know what he had done yet. So I posted it, and they all responded. And then it ended up in his hometown paper. And then weeks later, I get a phone call. And I didn't know the number, so I let it go to voicemail. And then I listened to the voicemail. It was his mom, "Hi, this is Deb Dunham. I'm calling. I read your story, and I'm calling to talk about my son." And I was just like, holy shit, what do I do? I was scared. Because I didn't know what to say to her,
Yeah.
And I understood that later on, years later, when a lot of these Marines, especially his company commander and his platoon commander, would tell me stories about reaching out to them for the first time because they were scared. They didn't know what to, you're a warfighting Marine, but you're afraid to call the mom. And I understood exactly what they were saying.
Right.
So a couple weeks go by, and she calls again, and I know it's the number now, and I don't answer it. I let it go to voicemail again. And I sat there for about a half hour, and I just told myself, I got to call this woman. So I picked up the phone, called her. And the first thing I said to her, I said, "I've wanted to call you. I just don't know what to say to you. Sorry seems too little too late. I'm sorry what happened to your son." And we were on the phone for 2 hours, me, her, and her husband. And by the end of that conversation, she invited me up to Scioto, New York, which is in Western New York along the Pennsylvania border out near Buffalo. And she said, we're having this balloon rally here, 4th of July weekend. They're going to honor Jason. Why don't you come up for it? So I booked a flight with a Khe Sanh Marine from San Diego, who's since passed. 2 other Khe Sanh Marines drove up from New York City, and we all met in this little town of Scioto, 1,200 people, 1 stoplight. I showed up at the door, knocked on the door. She opened the door, and she just hugged me.
Wow.
And it was emotional, man. It was really emotional. And, they wouldn't let me stay at the motel in town. They're like, "You're staying with us," And I'm like, this woman doesn't even know me. And she's inviting me into her home. And that was the beginning of why I understood who Jason was, right, as an individual, and where he was brought up right, great parents.
Yeah.
So that started a lifelong friendship with the Dunhams. And then while I was there that weekend, one of the Kilo guys, his wife was there too, visiting, Mark Dean's wife, Becky. And, she knew Jason really well. Her and Mark were really close with him. He used to stay at their house on base all the time. And, she was really worried, about Mark and what could happen to him now that Jason was gone.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we spent a lot of time, hanging out, and I got to go up to the cemetery. I went up there one day by myself, and, what do you say? I told him I was sorry this happened to him, but I said, you obviously made that decision to do what you needed to do. And, there's Marines alive for it today, and kind of just made peace with it all. And, went home, got back to LA. And by now I'm like in contact with some of the Kilo guys who are still in Iraq, because their deployment didn't end until September, So I got to know them through emails a little bit. And in September, I went up to 29. It's 3 a.m. The buses roll through the front gate. I got to see all that, the welcome home, all the families. It was amazing. And I really got to start to meet all the Kilo guys that night. And then from that point forward, we just, we all became close friends, and I wasn't thinking about a document. I wasn't thinking about any of that stuff. And I still hadn't learned about what he did. And our buddy Tom called me one day, and he's like, did you see the Wall Street Journal today? And I said, no, why? He's like, that kid you told me about's on the front page. Do you know what he did? And I said, no, what did he do? He's like, go get the paper. So I ran out and got the paper, and I read the story that Mike Phillips wrote. And I'm like, oh my God, that's unbelievable.
Yeah.
I mean, and it just got deeper after that, all the things, about how he did it, why he did it, how he'd been practicing, that scenario just weeks before. Those are the little tidbits I learned along the way. So, I started hanging around with these guys a lot. I'd bring them down to the house. The first thing I did was I brought them to San Diego, and I introduced them to Bob Arata and Glenn Prentice. Both of these guys served on Hill 881 South under Bill Dabney, Captain Dabney, who was Chesty Puller's son-in-law. He has since passed as well. But he was the company commander up there on 881 South. And Bob and Glenn, they had already been down that road, right? Gone to war, have dealt with all the issues that they dealt with throughout their life.
And real quick, Dave, Hill 881 South, that's Khe Sanh in Vietnam.
Khe Sanh, yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And for anybody who doesn't know, the two furthest points in South Vietnam at that time were those two hills. The combat base was behind to the south. Anything north of that was all NVA. So, and yeah, people can look that up. That's a whole nother crazy battle. But, doing that documentary about Dennis and his Marine buddies, there were 4 of them all together that went to Khe Sanh. We went to Khe Sanh. We hiked up to the top of Hill 861. We hiked up to 881 South, elephant grass, leeches, mud, the whole deal. It was like we were on a patrol, right? And I love history, and I have been absorbing, the Vietnam War since I was 12, right? The first book I ever read, A Rumor of War by Philip Caputo. I was 12 years old. I'm like, what the hell am I reading this for? My dad wasn't in Vietnam. My uncle was a Marine. He was there in 65, and then he was there for Tet in 68 in Hue City. But I just had this fascination with the Vietnam War. So I decided to do a documentary on their return. And it was a very amateurish, no money, small budget, but just sitting with those guys and learning about post-traumatic stress and actually seeing it. Because on the trip, these guys were fighting with each other and yelling at each other. So I started to understand a little bit about post-traumatic stress and what it does to people and their behaviors and stuff like that. So it kind of, in a way, prepared me for what I was about to get into, because these guys started coming to my house, and, so I took them down to Glenn and Bob, and they, talked to them at least 2 weekends we went down there, which was great. And so I started talking more with the Kilo guys, and it was actually the Khe Sanh guys who were like, you should do a story on this kid. Somebody should do a story. Yeah. So I started interviewing these guys, maybe October of 2004 down at my house. And man, it was brutal, because it was so fresh. Those were the hardest interviews I've ever had to do because it was so close.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. So you were interviewing these guys in 2004, so they must have just gotten back.
Yeah, they were. Yeah, everything was fresh. It wasn't like the Quezon guys where they had 30 plus years to think about it, right? And it was hard, but it really showed me. I don't know how to say this, but out of those guys I interviewed, I could tell the ones that I needed to keep an eye on.
Really,
just from what I had learned from the Quezon guys, I knew right away, like Mark Dean, I got to keep an eye on him, check on him all the time, and I'll get to his story later. And Casta, he was another one that I was worried about, and this guy Peplinski, I was like, well, he's squared away. I don't have to worry about him. But later on, 15 years later, he had some trouble. So these things manifest themselves years later. People don't realize that. They think it's, one and done. They have the experience and then they're, have issues for a little while and then they go away. Sometimes those issues don't come up until 15 years later, 20 years later. So I when I was doing those interviews, I said, this isn't the time. This isn't the time to do this. And I kind of put it on the shelf and, just remained friends with them. They were doing a workup for their next deployment. They were going to Ramadi this time in 2005.
Jesus.
So now I'm like they're like little brothers to me, I'm 10, 15 years older than them. And I'm worried about them. One of the guys, Gerga, he's from Poland. He came over here when he was 16, graduated high school and joined the Marine Corps, right? Thick accent. He asked me one day, and he's like so like shy about it. He's like, "Hey, would it be okay if I leave my car at your house during the deployment?" I'm like, "Fuck yeah, dude! Are you kidding me?"
Yeah.
So he left the car there. They deployed, and I got a phone call one day. I'm at work, and it's a little staticky, and it's Gerga, and I'm like, "Holy shit, man! Are you back? Everything okay?" He's like, "Oh man, I'm in the Gov Center in Ramadi. I'm using the sat phone."
Oh no!
And I can hear the mortar. I can hear the mortar rounds going out. I'm like, "Dude, what is that?" He's like, "That's okay. They're outgoing." He's like, "Everything's cool, man." He's like, "How's my car?" And I'm like, "Your car, bro." I was like, "How you guys doing over there, man? Everybody okay?" Man. He's like, "Yeah, man. Everything's good. Nobody got hurt." Wow. So I thought that was funny, And then they came back from that deployment, and it came down the next day. Like I had a big cookout at my house.
Oh, nice.
I don't know if Tom was there. I don't think Tom was there. So we had a big cookout, but as you know, because you've been around combat veterans, they're like, you step off the battlefield back into the world. Things aren't, guys are walking around the yard with big sticks. They're all amped up. They want to, they want to break shit. My wife's inside looking out the window. Are those guys okay? And I'm like, yeah, they're fine.
Yeah. So
I just wanted them to blow off some steam, and just have some kind of normalcy and just get them all in the room and let them talk,
Yep.
Because I had learned all this stuff from the Quezon guys, and I mean, I didn't know what else to do, I love these kids and I'm just trying to do whatever I can, because at that time, in my mind, I felt like every American should be doing something.
Yeah.
I don't care if you're sending a care package or buying that kid a steak dinner, do something, because unless you know someone who was in the military or you served in the military or you've had a loved one who was killed in a war and you're able to actually speak to people who have been through that experience, they don't understand, they don't understand what these young guys and girls go through on a daily basis in a wartime situation. So I was doing everything I could to help, and then these guys, some of them started to get out. Mark Dean was going to get out, and I was like trying to talk him into re-enlisting. I was like, well, maybe you should stay in a little long, because I was really worried about him.
Yeah. He
just wasn't all there, and there were things happening that I didn't know about at the time. So he said, "No, man, I'm going. I got accepted through the MECEP program. I'm going to become an officer. I'm going to Oklahoma State." And I'm like, "Oh, okay. All right, cool." Because I was afraid he'd go back to Oklahoma and he doesn't have his boys around him anymore, right? And he's going to get in trouble.
Yeah.
He's got nobody to talk to.
Yep.
He's going to internalize all that, start drinking, drugging, whatever he's going to do. And, that's what happened. He went through the MESAP program, but he got kicked out because he popped positive for marijuana or something.
Yeah.
And it just spiraled out of control after that. You know, he was on meds from the VA for his injuries, and he got addicted to painkillers. And then they cut him off, and he went to the street, started buying pills, and that turned to heroin. And then his wife left him, and now he's on the street, homeless, in the streets of Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I didn't even know this was going on. Right? I called his wife one day and talked to her for like 15 minutes. I'm like, hey, so is Mark home? She's like, no, Mark doesn't live here anymore. And then she just kind of opened up and told me everything, because it was like, you know, a big secret. And I couldn't believe it. You know, I couldn't put the kid he was then to the kid he was that I knew back in California. So right away, I'm trying to do what I can. I'm calling Neil Kenny, a Quezon veteran who had his own demons in the 70s with heroin. You know, this guy was an alcoholic, a drug addict, and he was a New York City police, officer. And he was drugging on the job. You know, it was the 70s.
Yeah.
So, but he's been in recovery. I mean, he's been, sober for 40 something years. So he really helped out. You know, we got him into rehab and stuff, but he always bailed. So it was probably right after that I decided in 2019, I called Trent Gibson, who was their commanding officer at the time, a captain. And he, by then I think he had just retired as a lieutenant colonel, or he was still in. I think he had just retired. So I told him what I wanted to do. I said, hey, man, it's been 17 years. I said, we need to tell this story. I said, but the Marines of Kilo need to tell it, because a lot of them have had troubles. And I'm hoping that if they talk about that stuff, it'll help them and it'll help anybody else out there, because a lot of these guys who had troubles were now okay. Right. Mark wasn't, but a lot of them were okay, So he's like, Roger that. He's like, call Deb and Dan, and I've always stayed in touch with him. So I called him up one day and I said, this is what I want to do. And mind you, they had movie studios after them to do a movie. They were under contract with some studio under option that they just kept renewing every year, right? Somebody wrote a script. The Dunhams didn't like it because it was Hollywood, right?
Yeah,
it was just Hollywood
bullshit.
Story.
Yeah,
it was all bullshit. So I just told him straight up. I said, look, this is what I want to do. I want to tell your son's story, but I want the Marines of Kilo to tell it. And I want you to tell it, because that's who should tell it. Nobody else should tell it.
Yeah.
So Dan, it was quiet for a few seconds on the phone. He's like, we're behind you. They said, we've said no to everybody, but we're saying yes to you because we trust you.
Yeah.
We like what you want to do with this, and you have our blessing. So I was like,
damn, dude,
okay.
that's awesome.
Yeah. And I was still working. By now, I was working at DirecTV Entertainment as a producer. So I just put the wheels in motion. I didn't know what I was doing, Started all the social media accounts, did an Indiegogo account. I reached out to Jocko down in San Diego. I said, hey, bro. I said, how would you like, I said, I'm doing this thing on Jason Dunham, Medal of Honor recipient. How would you like to have the two Marines who were standing next to him when that grenade went off and lived?
Yeah.
And 24 hours later, he's like, let's do it. He called me up. He's
What
like, let's make
year
it
was
happen.
that? What year was that interview? Do you remember?
2019. It was in November. Okay. Yeah. It's episode 203. I think he's up to like 500 now, but, and he paid for everything, man. He flew these guys out. He paid for the Airbnb. He was just a solid guy, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so we went in there and did that. It was Billy Hampton, Kelly Miller, and those are the two Marines who were with Jason. And I'll tell you the story about that. Ferguson was the platoon sergeant, and then Trent Gibson, the commanding officer. So the four of them.
And real quick, before you keep going, Dave, Dean, the one who had all the problems afterwards, was he the one that was dragging him off the street? Was he the young in the show? He's got the.
That's Sanders.
Sanders, okay.
Sanders was the radio operator.
Got it.
That guy. I'll tell you about his interview in a minute, but so we did that interview with Jocko, and he plugged it for us, and then I started pitching to two different production companies in Hollywood. One was Film 45, which is Pete Berg's company. And Pete Berg wasn't in on the meeting, but all his, executives were. Right. And they loved it. They were like, this is a great story, And I was like, oh, okay. And my buddy at the time, he's like, I think this is going to happen. I think they're going to pay for this doc. And in the back of my mind, I'm like, man, I hope they don't, because as soon as they do, I'm beholden to them, Then I went to another production company, Beverly Hills. And, these people are really nice, but this story was too personal and I wasn't about to just give it away to anybody just to get money to make it. And so I went into this guy's office, with my team of guys and I pitched the thing to him and he's like, man, I love it. He's like, I'll find the money for the doc, but I'm interested in doing like a 5-part series like Generation Kill. And as soon as he said, my uncle was a Marine, so I kind of understand, I just thought to myself, man, you have no fucking clue.
Yeah.
I said, you don't understand anything.
Yeah.
So I left that meeting and the guys are all outside with me and they're all excited. They're like, man, I think this guy's going to, this is going to be great. And I'm like, he's not the guy. And they're like, what? I'm like, I'm not taking his money. And they're like, are you kidding me? And I'm like, no, man. I said, you don't understand. I said, once we take his money, he's going to tell us what to do. And I'm the guy that's got to go back to these Kilo Marines and the Dunhams and tell them why it got all fucked up. I'm not going to do that. So they're like, well, where are we going to get the money? And I said, I don't know. We'll figure it out.
Dude, the fact that you are that close and that tight with them and looking out for their best interest, I mean, that's awesome.
And it plays that fact
trust
alone
played
into why those interviews are so good.
Yeah.
Because when I sat down with them, especially, Jason Sanders, and I love that kid. I've always loved that kid. And I sat down in his, work barn there in Oklahoma. And he's got all this gear around and the lawnmowers he's working on. And we're setting up and I'm sitting down across from him. And he's like, he looks at me. He's like, you ready? I said, yeah, man. He's like, good, because I'm going to give you everything. He said, I'm going to do it because I trust you.
Yeah,
and I was just like, awesome. Holy shit. So that was the most unbelievable interview I did out of all of it, because I couldn't believe what he was telling me, and his wife was off in the distance and it's a big barn. And she came up to me later and she said, thank you, because he needed to get that out. He has never, ever talked about any of that stuff ever. Yeah. This is the first time. And some of my crew were Marines or veterans. A few were just civilians. And I tried to staff the crew with veterans. I was trying to build this as, it's a film by veterans for veterans, right?
Right.
And when I started going that route, a lot of the Hollywood people were like, well, you're going to alienate the general public. And I'm like, I don't give a fuck. You know what I mean? That's what it is, man. Yeah. Because most people won't watch it unless they know somebody who went to war or they've been to war. So,
and that's the thing. Excuse me for interrupting here, because this is important. This is important. And that is, I think right now in today's world, the vast majority of Americans either know a vet or have one in their immediate family. I mean, everybody is going to get a lot out of this thing. I mean, it's just, it's incredible.
Yeah. I mean, we've been at war for 20 years.
Yeah,
we were at war for 20 years. So there's, a vast majority of people have some connection to it.
Yep.
So, but that particular interview, I'd never seen this before. My crew, especially the civilian guys, they all got up and one by one walked up to Sanders and hugged him.
Yeah.
He gave him a pat on the back and said, hey, man, thanks, thanks.
Yeah.
And I just watched that and I was like, holy shit, man, this is what it's all about right here. This is it right here. So I knew we had something, So, we did all the interviews. I know I'm jumping ahead, but we started in Eureka, drove up to Washington, the mountains in Washington. Billy Hampton's there. Miller was at Eureka. Skirted down to New Mexico to Farmington, where this kid Cifuentes lived. He's a cop. Then across to Oklahoma for Mark Dean's wife and Sanders and Rithy Yorth, who's, a Cambodian kid from Long Beach who's now a cowboy in Oklahoma, right? Hunts, fishes. Great kid.
America, right there,
yeah,
America.
Yeah. So I was supposed to interview Mark because Mark was still, on drugs at the time, but I was still going to interview him. And, he was supposed to meet me at this park. I had my crew there. We had, we were set up to shoot. I was on the phone with him the night before and he was just yelling and screaming. He was in a rage. And I had Billy, this, Marine who served in Fallujah. I said, start recording this, I don't think it's in the version that you guys have seen that we released, but I have a 5-part series as well, which goes deeper.
Yeah.
Right. I was actually just working on it before we got on here. But there's a lot of Mark Dean's story in there, and I wanted to use his ranting and rave because he was, high on drugs, on meth, and ranting and raving about the VA and how he lost it. He was basically blaming everybody for what has happened to him.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I said, I want you tomorrow. I want you to meet me at this park down by the river, the Arkansas River, downtown Tulsa. And I want you to sit down for an hour and I'm going to interview you. He's like, okay, I'll be there. 10 o'clock, I'm waiting, 11, 12, 1. I waited 3 hours. I kept calling him, no answer. I knew where he went. He went to, get drugs.
Yeah.
So I just called him and left a message. And I said, hey, man, I got to head south to see Sanders. I hope you're okay. I love you. Hit me back when you can. And he didn't respond. So from there, we went to Illinois, picked up some more interviews with Kasta, Kova, the Polish kid, Gerga. And then we skirted over to the Dunhams, stayed with them for a few days, shot a bunch of stuff. Actually, we stayed for them for about a week because we did a lot of stuff there.
Is that when they had that
No,
big reunion at their place?
No, because this is in the middle of COVID. Of COVID. So then we went up to see Trent Gibson up in Lubec, Maine, which is the last town in America before you hit the Canadian border, right, on the seaboard there. And then after that, I headed to the Dunhams by myself. I drove home by myself and I stayed with them for a week and hung out and talked to them. But to back up a little, November 2019, I'm pitching. Nobody wants to give me money or I don't want to take their money. And my buddy's like, where the hell are we going to get it? I said, I don't know, man. We'll find it. We'll figure it out. And then I said to him, it would be great if there was a Marine out there somewhere who has been successful in life and stepped forward and helped pay for this. And on Christmas Eve, a month later, I get an email because I'm doing press with military.com and We Are the Mighty and all these places. I get an email from this guy, Anthony Taylor. And he said, hey, man, I just read the article on military.com. I'm a Marine. I want to talk to you about funding this film. Let's talk. So on Christmas Day, I called him. And I remember where I was. I was near Point Loma?
Yep.
Near Rosecrans?
Yep.
I'm out because I always go up to Rosecrans, right? Because I love that view up there. And I'm in my car sitting there. I'm talking to this guy for 2 hours. And at the end, he said, hey, man, listen. I want to come in for the whole thing. And I'm like, excuse me? He's like, yeah, man. He's like, I've done quite well for myself. I can afford this. And I'm a Marine. He was a Marine. You need to tell his story. Yeah. And I didn't know what to say to him. I was like, holy shit. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like, because I just mentioned it a month before that, like, wouldn't it be great if a Marine stepped forward?
Yeah.
And there's little things like this that have happened along the way with this project. And, we coined it the Dunham effect because every time something we're like, nothing's going to happen. All of a sudden, boom, something happens.
Yeah.
Oh, Jocko called and said he's bringing him on the podcast. Oh, we got all this money from this guy, Anthony.
Yeah.
And, I got a composer who called me, a big Hollywood composer who called me up. And, guy's British, but he's an American now and he's a patriot. And he said, I'm going to compose all your music for free. And I'm like, okay. Or the big, this big lawyer who's a Marine. He's a Mustang officer who became a JAG officer and now has a private firm and he's done quite well for himself.
Yeah.
Shows up at our premiere at the Marine Corps Museum at the Medal of Honor Theater and then talks to me 2 weeks. And he was in tears watching it, and he told me straight up, he's like, that is the best movie I've ever seen on war and Marines in war that I've ever seen. And at the end of that conversation, he's like, do you have legal representation? I said, no. He's like, well, you do now. He said, I'm your fucking lawyer. And I'm like, holy shit, the Dunham effect. Yeah. It feels like
it's the gift.
Right. Something has always been pushing me through a door. It's saying go. And I never used to pay attention to that stuff. Yeah. You get these clues in the universe. And when you're 25, you're like, whatever, man. But now I see it and I'm like, oh, okay. I get that. All right. Yeah. I'm going to follow that. Wow. So that's how we got the money to do it, And Anthony was completely hands off, had total faith in me, and said, just do your thing, man. Do your thing.
Yeah,
and
that's
we hit the road and did it. And, I'm sure I'm leaving out a lot of stuff, but you can ask me questions about it.
Well, let's do that. Let's give us the without giving, well, you're going to give the whole movie away. Tell us about that day. What happened?
So, to start off, Jason was a security forces Marine, right? He was stationed in Georgia at the sub base. So he was towards the end of his enlistment. I think he had a year left, and he was sent out to 3-4. And from my understanding, there was a bunch of security forces Marines who were, it's like, you've got this much time left. We're going to stick you, with 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines. So they had a bunch of corporals there. And then they decided, okay, well, we're going to send him up to 29 and spread him out between 3-7, 2-7. And so Jason, it's interesting because the Polish kid and a couple other of the guys actually met Jason when they had just finished boot camp, and now they're at SOI. So when Jason was with 3-4, he was in charge of this group of Marines. And Gerga's like, yeah, man, that's when I met him.
Yeah.
He was like in charge of us. He was a cool guy.
Yeah.
So that was Gerga's first time he met him. He's like, and then he came to our battalion, a few months later.
Yeah.
So, he went in there and right away, Ferguson, who was the platoon sergeant, he was a staff sergeant at the time, noticed right away, this kid's a leader.
Yeah.
Right. So they put him in charge of a squad. They made him a squad leader. So Jason was like really going hard training these kids. Right. And he was due to get out. They're going to go on deployment in January. He was due to get out in like March. So if he didn't want to go, he probably wouldn't have. He could have stayed behind or left in the middle of the deployment.
Yeah.
And, did his 4 years. He's out. But he went to the higher ups and said, hey, I want to extend my enlistment. And they're like, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, I train these guys. I'm not going to let them go over there by themselves. So I'm their squad leader. I'm responsible. I'm going with them. So he told Mark Dean this. They took a trip to Vegas, Mark and his wife, a few other Marines. And he told Mark that night, he said, hey, man, I extended. And Mark was like, well, are you crazy, man? You can go home. Go back to your family, man. You did your time.
Yeah.
And he looked at him and said, no, man, I want to make sure you come home alive. I want to make sure all you guys get to come home to your families. So he deployed with them. And, they got to Iraq, and they were taken over for the Army. And from what I heard, when the Army patrolled the streets of Husayba, it was all Humvees. They were never on foot. That changed as soon as Marines got there. They're like, we're getting out of the Humvees and we're going to go on foot patrols, right? We need to have that presence. So they started, doing patrols and stuff. Nothing was really happening. There was a few little skirmishes here and there, but nothing crazy. And, for a better understanding for people who don't know, Husayba was a funnel because you've got the border of Syria there. Yep. That was the first stop for these insurgents who were coming from Saudi Arabia, Syria, wherever they were coming from. They were coming through there on their way to Fallujah, on their way to Ramadi, right?
Hey, let me just interject something real quick, Dave.
Yeah.
And that border between Syria and Iraq was basically a berm of sand. There was nothing. Right. There was nothing. It was wide open.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I heard stories when these guys were on a patrol, they were actually in Syria.
Yeah.
And they didn't even know it, you know? And they were like, oh, man, we're going to create an international incident because the Syrians army was like, what are you doing here? And they were like, okay. It's like, are we going to start fighting? Or then they, cross back over. Yeah, it's a very porous border, right? Just dunes of sand. So, that's when Husayba really started heating up because there was a big insurgency in there because that was kind of like, it was like their, rest stop. It's like, okay, our first stop's Husayba, then we're going to go to Al-Qaim, and then we're going to mosey on down to Fallujah and Ramadi.
Yep, exactly.
So the Marines knew that. So they started the foot patrols, right? And they started, making their presence known. And at the same time, they were doing, the nation building thing and training police force and they built a police station. So on this particular day, let me back up to the April 13th, Matthew Lopez, Lieutenant Colonel Lopez, he was a battalion commander, came to Trent Gibson and said, hey, I need a security force for tomorrow. We're going to go visit the police station. I'm going out there in a convoy. So I need a security force out there. So Gibson gave it to Dunham. He said, you're up, man. He's like, you're going to provide security outside the police station while the battalion commander does his thing. And then we're all going to meet up next door at the abandoned water treatment center because they were looking for like a firm base, place they could set up, ops out of.
Right.
So, Dunham's like, Roger that. So he started, that process. And for people who don't know, you're a, squad leader, you need to write your patrol order, right? And it could take a while. So he was up till 2 a.m. in the COC writing his patrol order, and Gibson's in there and a few other Marines from Kilo. And Trent is looking at him. He's like, he's just he's bare chested. Guy's ripped. He's working on his order. And in walks 2 of his Marines, Bill Hampton and Carbajal. And they had plates of chow to give him food, right? And they're like, hey, Corporal, brought you some chow, midnight rations for people who don't know. It's like food for people who were working all day. So he's just kind of like, oh, man, thanks. And Trent has told me, he said, when I was going through OCS, officers would talk about, you'll know a good leader when you see his Marines taking care of him. And Trent said, I've never seen it. And there it was. These 2 Marines who could have been racking out, getting some sleep for the patrol the next morning, came in to take care of their leader. And he said, in my mind, it was as if they were crowning him as their leader. And I thought to myself, God damn, what would I do if I ever lost a Marine like that? It's 24 hours before the incident. So he finishes patrol order, hits the rack. And I think they rolled out at 0800, headed to the police station, in a convoy, did their thing. He had his, guys out there providing security. Battalion commander wraps up his thing, heads out. Gibson goes to the roof of the water treatment facility next door. And off in the distance, they hear the explosions and small arms fire. And Dunham comes running up the ladder to the roof and runs right up to Gibson. And Gibson's like, what do you think? And he's like, I think Lima's getting hit. And they thought Lima Company was getting in a firefight. They didn't know that the battalion commander's convoy was being ambushed. And they were taking casualties. The battalion commander was wounded. There's a lot of people hurt on that ambush. So that's when Trent said, well, let's go get those motherfuckers. So they mounted up and started racing towards where the gunfire is, right? Into the gunfire. And on the way, they started taking fire. The lead vehicle, they started getting rocketed. And an RPG came across the lead vehicle, so they stopped and dismounted. And they were in an area of Huseba where it was like a choke point. So Ferguson said, in my mind, whoever did that ambush was going to come through here because this is the only way they could come through. So he said, start doing hasty vehicle searches. So he said, as I was telling Dunham, what to do, I knew he was listening to me, but his eyes were fixed on one vehicle, a white SUV up the road, because 2 guys had hopped out of the back and ran. But the driver stayed there. So as soon as Ferg said go, he took off and went straight to that vehicle with Hampton and Miller. He walked up to the driver. Miller went around to the passenger side, and as Miller looked in the back, he saw the RPGs and AKs. And as he went to turn to tell Dunham, the guy had jumped out and grabbed Dunham, and they started fighting. Dunham took him to the ground and started wailing on him. Miller came around, and he had a police baton like an asp. He extended it, ran up and put a knee into the guy's chest and cracked him in the forehead 3 times, but the guy was still struggling. Now Hampton's coming up, and Hampton's standing over both of them because they're both on. Dunham's on the guy's right arm, holding it down, struggling. Miller's got his knee in the guy's gut, and then Hampton is standing above both of them with his weapon. Like, what do I do? Should I shoot him in the head? He's like, but if I do that, it's going to ricochet. And this is split seconds that stuff happens.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the last thing Jason said was, no, watch his hands. And then the guy had a grenade and he let it go. And that's when Dunham took off his Kevlar and laid it down on the grenade and then just laid on top of it. And then boom. And Miller and Hampton got blown out. And Miller describes it now as a slideshow. He doesn't remember it as an actual event. It's just slides. He sees different slides of Jason's body going up and then coming back down. And then he wasn't moving. So, and then, Sanders is on the radio and he's there too, 20 feet away or whatever. And he sees it go down. He gets blown down. He gets up and he runs right to Dunham and he crouches down. He said, "I got you, buddy. I got you." And he went to grab him, on the back of your flak, they have that hook where you can grab him. Yep. It's there for, dragging wounded. And while he was trying to do that, that insurgent who had the grenade stood up and started to run. The guy was obviously hopped up on something, right? You can't,
yeah, exactly.
You go through something like that, you're, blitzed out of your mind. So, but in that interview, the way Sanders described that, he gets it. And that's the thing about these interviews. It isn't like, he had to do an interview with somebody he didn't know. It was just me. So it was like we were in a zone and we were connected in that interview.
Yeah.
And he was just like, when that guy stood up, he started running. He's like, it was the weirdest thing, man, because we looked at each other and without him saying it, he knew, I knew what he was thinking, like, "You're about to kill me." And I was like, "Yeah, I am." He's like, and I dumped a whole mag into him. He said he just kept shooting till the guy just stopped. And, he still lives with that moment because they all do, right? What could they have done differently? There's a million different scenarios that go through their heads. So that was basically what happened. His whole squad was not there. And that's another thing that really eats up a lot of these Marines, because when they dismounted, Jason split the squad because it was like, okay, you're going up this street. I'm coming up this street. Carball, you take these guys there. We'll meet at the end. So while these guys are trying to go up to meet, all this happened. They didn't even know. They heard the explosion. So when they race over there, they see Jason there in the street, and that kind of beats them up. But so they got him out of there. Corman showed up out of nowhere. I think he came in from Cat White, another platoon, with another second lieutenant, McManus, who he's an interesting guy, man. You should have him on your podcast. Guy's on Wall Street now, right? He's a banker. And we've had conversations. He's like, "Man, I tell these fucking guys in the finance world, some of the shit we did. And it feels like they think I'm lying to them."
Yeah, just another big Wall Street banker bullshit.
Right. So he's like, so I gave him the book. "Here, read this fucking book, man.
Wow.
The Gift of Valor." So they got him out of there. And they got him to the med station. They couldn't get the helo in where they were, so they had to drive him to the helo. And I have footage of that. That's in the film.
Yeah. Yep.
That's not Jason on the stretcher. That's Miller. Because when they put him down, he actually stands up.
Oh, no way.
He couldn't even move his left arm. He was chewed up pretty good. So was Hampton. They were beat up pretty bad.
Yeah.
So they got Jason on the helo and they got him to Al-Assad. And that's when, Alpha Surgical, which is a Navy Marine Corps surgical unit, was there. It's like MASH, right? The helos come in. Yep. The doctors start assessing right away, get him into OR. He's stable, put him over here. That guy's not going to make him, put him in the expectant ward. And that's where, Heidi Kraft's story comes in, where she's a lieutenant commander in the Navy and she's a psychologist. So she used to help out wherever she could. So they saw Jason and they were like, he ain't going to make it. So they put him in the expectant ward. So she would often go in there and sit with these Marines, who were dying and medicated so they weren't in any pain because, they were all unconscious. And she walked in there that day for some reason and sat on the floor and it held Jason's hand. He squeezed her hand once and she really didn't think anything of it because he had a head injury and, body spasms or whatever. But then he kept doing it. And then so she finally bent down and whispered in his ear, "If you can hear me, I want you to squeeze my hand now." She said he squeezed it so hard, he pulled her whole body down on him. And she ran out of there and got the doctors and said, "You need to get him out of here." And right away, they got him on a chopper.
Yeah. Real quick, and I don't want to get gory here, but what is his condition? Is like his entire face wrapped up? I mean, what did that explosion do to his body?
Well, he took shrapnel, from what Dan told me, by his cheek. It went up into his brain.
Gotcha.
And then there was another piece over here that just basically went, it was either this side or this side. I can't remember, but just a piece of shrapnel just ripped right through his brain.
So his head's all covered up. He's probably he's covered up. So all she's kind of looking at is just sort of a bandaged up guy with his hands free.
I've never asked her that, but that's a good question. I'm assuming yes.
And I'm trying not to be disrespectful at all. I'm just curious what that.
No, these guys talk about it too. I mean, Mark Dean said, when I got to the site, and he was Jason's best friend. He's like, I got up there and I remember thinking to myself, that Marine's fucked up.
Yeah.
He didn't even know it was him because his head was swollen.
Yeah.
And then the corpsman, cut off his blouse, and that's when he saw Jason's tattoo. Yeah. And he was like, oh, fuck, man. And that's when he just lost it.
Yeah.
He's like, it was Jason. But, going back to that, a lot of these guys in the 5-part series I have really talk about the rage, that happened after that.
Right.
Because they were out for blood, and they wanted to fight. They were amped up to fight. They wanted payback. They wanted those insurgents to come fight them. They were itching for a fight. That incident changed those guys forever. They're still affected by it. That one incident, that one decision, changed their life forever. But so they got Jason on a chopper, and medevaced him to Baghdad. And from Baghdad, they sent him to Germany. Billy, Hampton, and Miller were also sent to Germany. Miller was banged up more than Hampton. Hampton was able to walk around, so he went up and saw Jason, got to see him, which really tore him apart to see him like that.
Yeah.
And Adam Walker, he's in the film. I didn't interview him, but he was hit 3 days later. On April 17th was basically the kickoff. They call it the Battle of Husaybah, where they went online and cleared that whole city. It was like a mini Fallujah,
Yep.
And that's when Walker got hit. So he was at the hospital, and he got to go up there and see Jason as well. And it broke his heart. But from Germany, they got him to Bethesda. By now, Dan and Deb are finding out about this stuff. The Marine Corps is contacting them. Your son's been injured. He's, not good critical, as Dan put it. And Dan said when he heard that, he's like, that's not good. And later on, and Dan said to me later, he's like, I knew he wasn't going to make it. I knew it was bad, but I couldn't say that in front of my wife because, not good critical is not good. And he said he knew from the phone call, where it was going to end up. So they got them down there. They stayed at the Fisher House, and they met with the surgeons, and, it was a woman and a man doctor, Navy doctors, and basically just telling him, this is what we got. They said, we've seen miracles. If he does survive this, he'll never be the same. He won't know his name. He won't be able to feed himself. That's if he survives. We don't think he's going to survive. And by now he's on a ventilator.
Yeah.
And Dan knew right away. He's like, they're asking me to make a decision. So Dan looked at them both and said, do you have kids? And they both started crying, the doctors. And then he said, what would you do? And the female doctor said, I would let him go. Mm-hmm. So they went out and sat, in the courtyard and talked for a while, him and Deb. And, Dan didn't want to make that decision alone, even though he was, the health proxy.
Right.
It was up to him, but he wanted to be a joint thing with him and his wife. And a lot of people don't realize that Dan and Deb are not his biological parents. Jason had a different father, a different mother. Dan, man, this would make a great movie. Dan got out of the Air Force. It's 1981. and he's driving on the back roads of New York, upstate New York, and he's on his way to a party. And he gets to that house. Everybody's having a party, and he hears a baby crying. There's a baby crying in the crib. So he walked in there, and he said, I looked down, and there was this beautiful blonde-haired, blue-eyed baby boy. And I just knew that he had to be a part of my life. So he ended up shacking up with this girl, married her, had a kid with her, Justin. Yeah. And a few years later, she had some issues, so she kind of bailed, left Dan with the kids. She disappeared. Wow. And, Deb had just arrived in DeSalle from Pennsylvania across the border, new school teacher in town. And they ended up hitting it off, dating, and got married. And that's the thing that gets me in the film every time I get choked up, especially when Deb tells the story of Mother's Day and Jason showing up over there. They were going to have dinner at her apartment, and he showed up with a card he made and said, he couldn't pronounce mother, so he would say mutter. And he just looked at her and said, I don't have a mother. Will you be my mother? And she said it just broke, She's like, I hope this works out because I love this kid. And she, from that day forward, they were her kids. She raised them, and Dan raised him. Yeah. And,
it, what stands out in the movie is he is a stud, or was a stud.
Oh, yeah.
Tall, handsome.
Poster boy for the Marine Corps.
Exactly. And it's just...
And he was born on the Marine Corps birthday.
Oh, no way. November 10th.
Yeah. That's all in the 5-part series. Yeah. He was born on November 10th.
That's, there's that saying that, out of 100 soldiers, 10 of them shouldn't be there. 80, 20 shouldn't be there. 79, are there just for kind of cannon fodder, and then there's one warrior, and those are the warriors that will go, that don't care what happens to them. They are, and they lead the fight, they win the fight. As I was watching this, and I'm kind of thinking about my role, I was obviously just one of the cannon fodder, but we had guys like him in our squadron that you just knew those guys were just, they didn't care what was going on. They wanted to be right in the thick of it. And, as you were talking just recently about, the guys seeing him in the hospital or actually seeing him on the ground, the one casualty that we had in our squadron, the first go, a guy named Dave Green, Rhino, was, and we were over Ramadi in 2004. So it was about 6 months before those guys got to Ramadi. And, he takes one through the canopy. He was a Cobra pilot. The front seater, who's still a great friend of mine, has to fly the thing back one engine. And it's from Fallujah, where we were basically, the airfield was about 10-minute flight, direct flight into Ramadi and into Fallujah. So it's right on the Lake Habanaya. And so Rhino bleeds out on the way back to the base. So so that was our first casualty. It was about a month before we were getting ready to rotate home. And the one thing I'll never forget is I remember they had the Cobra way off in the distance because they had to clean the fucking thing out. Right. And apparently the Marines that had to go in and mop out the floor of the cockpit, which was covered in blood, those guys really had a tough time with that. I remember standing there looking at that Cobra like, do I have the balls to go up and take a look at that thing? And I didn't. Because I knew that would just crush me if I saw that. I can't imagine what those guys were going through.
You can't forget those things, when you see them.
And those guys, just those guys seeing their buddy just in that condition, having just a week before the post, like you said, the poster boy warrior.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Fuck.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard stuff.
Yeah. So what do you have any plans for that 5-part series? Is there a future for this thing, or where are you with that right now?
I definitely want to get, it's done. I'm just touching up some things.
Right.
I definitely want to get it out there in some way. I'm hoping that there'll be enough attention brought to this self-release we did from, I don't know, HBO or Apple or somebody to, reach out and be like, I saw what you did. And I'll be like, well, I got a 5-part series. Because everybody I talk to, it's like, I have a 5-part series.
Yeah.
I reached out. I had talks with the Daily Wire, but they were kind of on the fence with it. And, that didn't go anywhere. But who knows? Maybe they'll reach out again, or just keep pressing. I don't have a problem knocking on somebody's door and say, look, motherfucker.
Yeah.
You need to watch this.
Yep. And again, it's called The Gift, and I found it on Apple TV. So if veterans and the military have any interest, you got to watch this. You got to watch this movie. So you obviously still keep in touch with the guys, and are they? Most of them are doing all right. At least the guys in the video all seem like they.
All of them, yeah, they're all doing great. Mark, after I left Oklahoma, I got a call from his ex-wife that time 6 months later. And she said, he was arrested. He's been locked up for like 6 months and he's clean.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I was like, all right. But I've been down that road before. I'm just like, okay, well, we'll see.
Yeah.
And then a whole year went by, and then we did the reunion because of COVID. We didn't do the reunion during the first run in 2020 because of COVID.
Right.
I didn't want to take any crap from that small town. Well, you got 100 Marines up there at the house. Everybody's going to get sick.
Yeah.
We want to get sick. So we planned the reunion for a year later in September.
Gotcha.
So we had the reunion there. Semper Fi Fund paid for all the food and everything. Those guys were great.
So great.
The whole backyard was just big army tents, a big bivouac thing set up. And Mark came up for that. He'd been clean for a whole year, and I actually interviewed him there. The stuff for the 5-part series. So, he's doing great, man. He's been clean now since October of 2020. So
wow.
it's all going on 5 years now.
Good. Knock on wood.
I don't know how he did it. I know how he did it. He turned to his religion and music, whatever it takes, man. I don't care as long as, you're clean.
And that's exactly. And most of, at least the guys that I've known that have had issues with the PTSD is you got to be able to find somebody to talk to. You got to find an outlet that you just can't keep it bottled up. It becomes like a clamped down steamer that eventually is gonna blow.
Yeah. I'll tell you this. I've gotten a lot of messages from people I don't even know through Instagram or whatever, veterans, combat veterans, mostly Marines, some Army guys, just thanking me.
Yeah.
They're like, man, I really needed that, to see this and to see the beauty of it, especially at the end, all those guys.
Yeah.
This one kid in particular today, he's a guy now, right? He's 40. He said, by watching that film, it's made me reach out to all my boys that I haven't talked to in years. Yeah. And I was like, that's what it's all about right there.
Yep. Yep.
And that warms my heart, to see that happening, because I was worried in the beginning. I'm like, am I going to be bringing up some of these bad memories, but I did the first interview with Ferguson, and he came up to me afterwards like, man, I needed that. And I was like, oh, okay, wait a minute. This is actually good because they're actually talking about it.
Yep.
They're not just keeping it all in. Same thing with Sanders. He let all that stuff out. So I hope it helps more guys.
Well, and it definitely will. And for me personally, it did. It made me redouble my efforts, because I used to, up until a couple of years ago, every July 28th, which is the day that Rhino died, I'd send out a big text message to all my boys. And, we do it on November 10th as well to wish each other happy birthday. But you have to work at it. You just can't let that. It's too important to let it slip away.
Was Rhino part of that crew down there in, what is that, Friar Tuck Road? Is that where that place was?
No, actually, Rhino was an East Coast guy. So the reserve squadron that I was with, we had a component on the West Coast and then a component on the East Coast. And so when we got activated and went over, we all joined up together. And most of the guys on the East Coast squadron were all from the initial invasion. So those guys were hardened warriors. And then you got guys like me who are just holding on to the tail stinger.
Yeah. Is that where they at, Lejeune, or is that Cherry Point?
No, those guys were, I think they flew out of McGuire it was either McGuire in New Jersey or down in New Orleans.
Gotcha.
So, but this is And I really wish you the best of luck with that 5-part series. I really hope that comes out because it
goes deeper. It's definitely, I've let a lot of the Kniess Marines watch it.
Yeah.
And they called me up. They're like, holy shit, man. He's like, I've sat down and I figured, all right, I'll watch one before dinner and I'll watch another tomorrow.
Yeah.
He's like, I couldn't stop watching. I was up all night watching this thing.
No, it's got a very much
okay.
It's got very much a Band of Brothers type of it brings you in and holds on.
That's my next step, man. I've had some interest from some producers in Hollywood about a feature film, but like I said, it's like it has to be the right person.
Yeah. Yep.
Because I think it'd make a great movie.
Yeah. Well, and you know what? Maybe this was intentional on your part, and maybe it wasn't. But the fact that you were communicating with those Vietnam vets as well, because those guys didn't have nearly the support structure that we had coming back. So you were probably doing great things for those guys.
Oh yeah. I didn't realize it at the time.
Yeah.
I was just trying to bring these two generations together because I knew one generation had already been, as Neil Kenny put it, he's like, we have the same book. I'm just a few chapters ahead of these guys. We're in the same book, man.
Yeah.
So it's helped them a lot.
Well, I'll tell you what, man, when I'd love to have you back on if that 5-part series gets any more traction. And again, the documentary is called The Gift, and it is absolutely unbelievable. An amazing story, an amazing kid, the legacy. It's really, really a great story. So thank you for putting it out there.
Absolutely.
All right, man. Hey, listen, I'll finish off like I always do. And that is if you're in the military, the police departments, fire departments, or first responders, if that's you out there, thank you very much for your service. Stay safe. Dave, thank you again, man. It was great talking to you.
Thank you.
All right, guys, it's the Rain Man. Take care. Thanks for watching Rain Man's Take, Observations on the World We Live in. If you like the content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. You can also follow Rain Man's Take on Instagram at Rain Man's Take. Also, check out our website at www.rainmanstakepodcast.com and send your comments to rainmanstake@gmail.com. Keep an eye out for future podcasts, which will be coming out every Thursday at 5 p.m. West Coast time.